One of the most common questions that I get is, when should I start preparing? How long should I prepare for? How much time should I spend each day doing that? So I think as it's the end of this series, I'm going to give you a bit of a guide of kind of where to start, how to think about preparing, and then how much time to spend each day when you actually get to the stage where you're really cranking up the intensity towards the end of your preparation. So I'd say you need to do it in 3 stages. The first thing is that you need to grasp the key concepts. Then you need to put them into practice, and then you really need to sharpen the axe so that you're really tight when it comes to exam day. So with the grasping phase, what you need to do is understand all of the theory. So you need to know all of the questions that come up, all the techniques available, and the best ones to answer each individual type of question. And there are lots of ways to do that. For example, my online course is one, but you can watch videos on YouTube, books, whatever it is to just get that knowledge in your head at the start. Then once you've done all of that, you're ready for the implementation phase, or whatever you want to call that second phase. At this point, you want to start actually practicing some questions. At that stage, you need to go to an online platform where you can do some question banks and just practice the questions. So this is the time where you're just practicing and getting in the reps. And at this stage, I would recommend that you just focus on individual sections at the time so that you can just really get comfortable and used to answering those types of questions, and then instinctively knowing what kind of techniques you need to use. At this stage, you don't need to worry too much about time practice, because here we're just laying the foundation. Now, once you've got to the stage where you've laid down the foundations with all the sections, it's time to really start cranking it up, and as I say, sharpening that axe, ready for the real exam. So the first thing you want to do before you really start cranking up the intensity is do a mock test to get a flavour of where you're at and use that as a barometer for your progress. The UCAT exam does have some official mock tests, but you want to use these as very precious resources that you ration out very carefully amongst your practice. However, towards the start of this stage, I would say that it's worthwhile doing one timed mock exam just so that you can get an understanding of kind of where you're at and where you need to get to. Once you've got that initial kind of marker, if you will, out of the way, it's time to start doing time practice in your online question banks. So what I recommend you would do with this is progressive overload. So you start at a time that's comfortable to you, and then just slowly but surely start cranking up the intensity. What you want to be doing before you move on to timed questions is make sure that you're getting about 80% accuracy when you're doing it in the comfort of your own home without any pressure, and you can make sure that you're getting at least 80% right before moving on to doing it under pressure. And then what you want to do is bit by bit increase the speed or reduce the time to make sure that bit by bit you're just getting a bit faster but maintaining that accuracy that you had previously. It's important to keep monitoring your progress to make sure that you know how you're getting on, kind of where you need to be versus where you are, so you know how much work you need to do to get to your target score. Now, you can use these mock papers along the way to kind of track your process, but I would recommend after the first one's done that you kind of load them towards the end of your practice, so as you're cranking up the intensity, you have more of these to work with. But these are going to help you track your progress and get a good idea of kind of how you're improving as time goes on. Now, an important thing is when you do a timed mock paper, it will be 2 hours, so it'll feel like a lot of work, and after you won't feel much like doing anything because it'll be a bit of an assault on your brain. But once you've had a rest, it's really important to take the time, and it's usually probably another 2 hours to go through all your answers and just work through all the things that you got wrong, but also what you got right and the reasons why, and understand and learn from that theory. So that journey is very hard to put a timeline on, because for some people that journey will be 3 weeks, for some people it will be 3 months to get the score that they want. So that's why I recommend doing the groundwork part of that early, understanding the questions, knowing all the techniques, and then at least doing a mock exam so you can get an idea of where you are. If you've done it all and you do a mock exam and you do quite well in that and feel that with just a short amount of preparation time you can actually do quite well, then well done. That means that you don't need to prepare too intensely. However, on the other hand, if you don't do as well and you're not sure that you're going to do well, then that would mean that you probably need to do a lot more work to get the score that you want. But that process that I've just explained to you should kind of help you work out where you lie on that 3 week to 3 month timeline, and exactly how much time you might need when it comes to preparing for your own UCAT. The other thing that I will say is in the day-to-day UCAT preparation, people also ask me, how long should I be spending each day preparing? Well, the thing that I suggest to do is take a step back and look at what the UCAT is doing. The UCAT is a 2-hour test that's essentially mentally bombarding you with a load of brain teasers for 2 hours straight. So you need to get prepared and ready for being able to cope with that pressure for 2 hours without stopping and being on form for the entire exam and all the sections. That's why in my previous videos you may have seen me compare this to sprint training. When someone trains for sprinting, they don't do 5 hours of non-stop sprinting because of course the intensity and the speed is what matters as well. So really you need to do short bursts, so 2-hour bursts maybe of revision, maybe a little bit more, and then long rest periods to help you recover. It's been proven that meditations and things like Yoga Nidra or something like the Reverie app for a meditation immediately after a deep learning session, any of those practices increase brain neuroplasticity, which helps you learn and apparently increases learning by 50% according to some studies. Then you have your break, and then once you're well rested, maybe a few hours later, or if you've done a morning session, go again in the afternoon, you're then ready to do another 2 to 3 hour session. But the thing that people fall down on is when they try and do these 4 or 5 hour marathon sessions, where if you think about it, your brain is just getting bombarded so intensely. But of course, after 4 or 5 hour sessions like that, it's understandable that your performance starts to suffer a little bit. Again, back to the sprinting analogy, if you were sprinting literally all day non-stop, then of course the speed and the performance is just inevitably going to go down. So now I'm going to give you my top revision tips for the UCAT, and then finally I'm going to give you some tips for how to perform well on the actual day. So number one, to reiterate what I said, make sure you've laid the groundwork and know the foundational skills before you move on to doing timed questions. So my top tips for preparing for the UCAT, just to reiterate a previous point that I've said, is to make sure that you've laid the foundations and are comfortable with all the theory and types of questions before you go on to attempt any questions in the question banks. The next thing is, as I said before, make sure that you're hitting about 80% accuracy with your question bank practice before you move on to doing timed questions. Number three is to make sure that you tackle one section of the UCAT at a time. It shows way much more improvement if you spend intense focus on one particular section and then shows considerable improvement in that before moving on, rather than spreading your efforts and diluting them across all 5 sections. There's a fantastic book by Greg McKeown called Essentialism, and he talks about how individual focus on one thing at a time shows way more improvement in a linear direction rather than random energy scattered across lots of things. And when it comes to the sections, you will have a hyper-focused improvement phase, and then you'll have a maintenance phase, basically to keep the skills that you've had and keep your abilities at a certain score and a certain timing. My fourth tip is, once you feel like you've mastered one section, move on, but then just keep doing the occasional question here and there with the sections that you feel you've mastered, just to keep things ticking along and just keep those skills. And my final tip is to practice on a screen. The UCAT's done on a screen, you'll be doing it on a computer, so get used to mimicking the exam situation as much as possible. And that means really, once you've got used to it and beyond the foundational stage, leave the books behind, because they are not like what it feels like doing it on a computer. It feels different, it looks different, and it is different. So just make sure you get used to that rather than doing questions in them. And the final bit that I'm going to talk about from this monster video is how to perform well on the day. If you have watched any of the videos where I recommend the Andrew Huberman podcast, he talks about sleep being an absolute superpower. The more well rested you can be for the day, the better your mental agility will be and better your score. If you want to have a listen to his podcast, he'll tell you about how to relax the night before and make sure that you get a really good night's sleep. And with that, it's really important to reduce the stimulation. So the evening before, maybe even the afternoon before, don't do any UCAT, just spend the time to relax and get yourself well rested ahead of for a good night's sleep the night before, and just to keep yourself in a place where you're not agitated by questions and things that are bothering you. So while you're doing that, you can do things like prepare all the essentials that you need. So prepare your bag and your ID that you're going to need for the exam. The brain is the highest energy consumer in the whole body, so when you have intense bouts of concentration, you need to make sure that you're providing it with adequate fuel. So make sure that you've eaten a very high calorie meal and that you're super well hydrated. Again, Andrew Huberman on his podcast, I absolutely love this at the moment. He talks about the optimum hydration for when you're doing deep focus or high physical activity. And he says that you should have what really equates to pretty much a pint an hour. He actually divides it into 3 and talks about how much you need every minute, but for the average human, about a pint an hour is what you need to have your brain performing at an optimum level in terms of hydration. And then on the day, things to remember are: use the booklet when necessary, use the calculator only if you need to. If you can do things in your head, that's going to save you so much time. Use the flag function if you're stuck. Be ruthless with questions and just guess and then move on. And then finally, use those keyboard shortcuts that I talked about. So Alt-C for the calculator, Alt-N for next question, Alt-F for flag, and so on. And finally, probably the most important piece of advice that I can give you for on the day is not to panic. You might want to prepare yourself for a situation where you have 1, 2, or maybe 3 questions in a row that you don't know what to do. The worst thing that you can do in that scenario is kind of panic, throw all the techniques and things that you've learned out the window and just go into absolute chaos mode. So if you mentally prepare for that situation and how you're going to deal with it, it's going to help you to remain calm and not be fazed by it and let it 1 or 2 questions affect the subsequent questions and ultimately your performance and score. So that brings us to the end of what has been quite a long video and a really great series. I've enjoyed making this. If you want to check out the playlist of more SJT videos that I've made, especially with about 4 or 5 lessons, including questions and then some techniques as how to answer them, you can check that out here. Otherwise, if you want to see the other videos like this for all the other sections, I've done a video for each of these which is a bit shorter than this because it didn't have all the stuff about exam technique, but it will have about 8 to 10 of the highest impact tips for each of the sections. And you can check out the first one here, which is the verbal reasoning one. So I hope you've enjoyed the series. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in one of those subsequent videos.